One day back in 1984, our Korean ambassador back then, Ted Moses, I bumped into him and he said, "Why don't you travel to Geneva with me? We'll be starting some work on a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People." And he said, "You don't have to do anything, just watch how it's done, and if you're interested, you can continue." So this journey for me on the UN Declaration started way back in 1984. So it's been more than 3 decades for me.
We worked along with other indigenous groups around the world so that we could draft something that would be useful for all indigenous people around the world.
It took us 23 years to negotiate and draft the terms of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 1984 to September 2007, when the UN General Assembly finally adopted. When I got elected in 2011, I introduced legislation to make sure that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is fully adopted and implemented here in Canada. I failed to do so in my first term, and I reintroduced another legislation when I got re-elected in 2015.
Close to a dozen of us who were in my living room, and that's when we first sat down with Romeo and heard about this bill and what it could accomplish. You know, we know that Canada has a deep colonial past and a pretty thick colonial present, and we need to reshape this relationship. So what is it that we can do here? And 262 was a very tangible place for people to put their energies into and saying, this is an express response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls that the federal government adopt and implement the Declaration. 262 outlines a way that we can do that. And so people got behind that quite quickly, because we are communities that speak quite easily about reconciliation, but sometimes struggle then in the application of, so how do we do that in a good way that's not continuing our colonial postures towards Indigenous peoples, but's responding to Indigenous-led initiatives. And it was in hearing Romeo's spirit and intent behind this declaration that got us really animated.
The day I was released from residential school, having spent more than 10 years in residential school, I came out of there with two objectives. One of them was to go back to the bush, live the Cree way of life, which I did for about 2 years. And the other one being find a way to reconcile with the people that put me away for 10 years. Bill C-262 and the UN Declaration. This was my extended hand to those people.
So we did teach-ins, then we started to do advocacy work. We sent off more than 30,000 postcards to members of parliament and eventually the Senate. So the senators received postcards, letter writing campaigns. We did a pilgrimage in 2017.
So the Pilgrimage for Indigenous Rights was a 600-kilometer walk from Waterloo, Ontario to Ottawa, Ontario. So the walk was in support of the private members bill, Bill C-262.
Every night we did teach-ins at the church or community center we were at. I guess I was surprised at how many people came each night to hear what everyone had to say and how many people actually supported the bill. I feel like people would listen more if it was young people who were pushing this.
The bill is asking the government to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Here are some examples of why we need to adopt UNDRIP. Native children going to schools on reserve receive a lot less money than a child in a public school. A Native child gets $3,500 less funding than a public school child. Native people are treated a lot different than white people. For example, more than 150 First Nations today don't have clean drinking water. Finally, many Native peoples were here before the settlers came. So why hasn't the government given them back some of their land while they're on tiny reserves? I'm walking on this pilgrimage for many reasons. One of the reasons is because I think that Indigenous people should have equal rights like everyone else.
We shed tears, we shared stories, we got to know each other as human beings, we published together, we sang together, we walked together. We started a movement for human rights for Indigenous people throughout the country.
The day that we arrived in Ottawa, it was just kind of a rush of emotions. It was just this sense of like, this could be big, this is happening.
Each stage, we're just like, is it gonna get through this stage? There was so much adrenaline going for so many months, working hard, pulling off teach-ins in Ottawa, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Vancouver.
After being passed by Parliament with the support of all parties except the Conservative Party, the bill was defeated in the Senate. Bill C-262 got defeated by unaccountable, unelected, and undemocratic Senate. Democratically elected MPs voted in favor in the Parliament, but those 5 Conservative senators decided otherwise.
Their key anxieties are around those articles that talk about self-determination and free prior informed consent.
And they interpreted that as giving the First Nations a veto. Now, there's nothing in the United Nations Rights of Indigenous People or in Bill C-262 that refers to veto. What it does talk about is the responsibility for consultation, and that already exists in the Canadian law. You know, that industries, governments need to consult with First Nations people whenever they do anything on their territories. So this notion of veto was really misleading, and I was kind of sad to realize that that's exactly what they did. They used whatever veto powers they may have had to kill the bill.
It does come back to Native people's jurisdiction and say as to what happens to their traditional lands and waterways. That's the holdup around this. How are we going to imagine living together in these shared lands where Indigenous peoples actually have authority and say?
There are a lot of people that cried, disappointed, angry.
When I found out that the bill wasn't passed, it's hurtful, it's violent, it's neo-colonial violence that Canadians from across the country are not okay with. When I found out about it, I thought, you know what? These 5 senators are not going to kill my fight. These 5 senators will not kill the fight of the thousands and thousands of Canadians across this country who have worked tirelessly. We are going to continue. I am going to continue until minimum human rights standards are realized for all Indigenous people in Canada.
All the messages, emails, phone calls, text messages said the same thing. This fight will continue. We want this fight to continue. This fight will continue. That's been the message throughout to this day. And I won't be a member of Parliament after the next election because I've decided not to run, but I'll stick around to stand by those people that want this as the framework for reconciliation in this country.
When I'm elected, I'm going to push this through again. I think the momentum is going to continue to build, and we will not stop until fundamental Indigenous human rights are realized in Canada.
I will continue to argue that these rights are human rights. I'm serious about reconciliation. It's not just a word for me, it means a lot to me. That was my mission when I came out of residential school, and I guess I have to continue that fight.
We're on the next phase of our human rights journey. Make sure you still organize events, organize talks, have focus group circles, stay active and keep pressuring the Senate. Contact the Senate and let those senators that did not approve the bill and let them know that this is not okay and that you're going to keep speaking up. Contact your current members of parliament and let them know that if they want to get elected, that they need to support the full adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
I do want to thank the many, many millions of Canadians that supported Bill C-262, that supported the fundamental human rights of Indigenous peoples, the Indigenous organizations, the Indigenous communities, the churches, the human rights organizations, the towns and cities that adopted resolutions in support of the Declaration and also Bill C-262. One of the most beautiful words in Cree is Nuijawagan. Nuijawagan means literally he or she that walks by my side. And I find that beautiful because that's literally what happened during this journey. So I'm very grateful. I'll be grateful forever for that support and standing by me and walking by me. Miigwech.